Welcome back to A Book Like No Other. When we last left our heroes, that would be me and Rabbi Fohrman. Well, I don't know if I would call myself a hero, maybe a sidekick? Regardless, we were knee-deep in our exploration of Tehillim chapter 126, Shir HaMaalot. Last time, we had examined the first half of the song. In it, we explored the possibility that for the captives of Zion to embrace the joy of redemption, they needed to get out of a dreamlike daze by working through their residual trauma. Now, as Rabbi Fohrman and I sat down to learn together today, we were ready to jump into the second half of Shir HaMaalot and examine its meaning. Well, we were almost ready to jump into the second half. Because before we took a close look at those final three verses, there was something we needed to do first. Rabbi Fohrman had noticed connections between this entire chapter of Tehillim and another section of Tanakh all the way back in Genesis. And he suspected that the link between these two sections of the Bible would actually give us a whole new way of understanding that second half of the song. So we're going to check out those connections first. From Aleph Beta, I'm Imu Shalev, and this is another episode of A Book Like No Other, generously sponsored by Shari and Nathan Lindenbaum.
Okay, so what I want to do then is play one of our favorite little games here, our intertextuality game, where have we heard these words before? And we're going to do that with the bookends of Shir HaMaalot. So we're going to take the first image from Shir HaMaalot and the last image of Shir HaMaalot and just see what they are. The first image, Shir HaMaalot, B'shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion, Hayinu Kecholmim. When God returned our captives, Hayinu Kecholmim, we were like dreamers. Okay, so the very first image, dreams, this unreality, this dream. Now, the second image, the last image in the psalm is that you got this guy walking around crying, Nosei Meshach Hazorah, holding his bag of seeds, Bo Yavo Verina. He's going to come enjoy Nosei Alumotav. He's going to be holding his sheaves. So the last image is sheaves, right? Sheaves of wheat. And now I want to put those two images together. Dreamers, sheaves of wheat, dreamers holding sheaves of wheat. What does this remind you of?
That reminds me of Yosef. Who had a dream, I think, about Alumot, about these bundles of wheat, that the 11 that bow to the one, to his bundle of wheat.
Yep, that's the dream. Hey, I had this crazy dream. We were all in the field and we were all, we were harvesting this wheat. And suddenly my sheaf of wheat stood up straight and your sheaves of wheat all went and bowed before my sheaf of wheat. And it gets him in a whole bunch of hot water. Well, really, it gets him in a pit. The brothers are very upset about this. Here's this narcissistic little kid, 17-year-old with dreams of grandeur. He's going to take over the family. And that's what they say. You think you're going to rule over all of us? You're going to be the king over us? And they hated him, both for his dreams and for his telling them about the dreams. So this is sort of part of the beginning of the end for Joseph, these terrible dreams. But they seem to make this cameo appearance. Is it just our imagination? Are we dreaming if we think that Shir HaMaalot includes references to Yosef's dreams? So you might think, well, maybe that's a coincidence, like there's lots of dreams about sheaves of wheat, but are there? Like, there's not really that many dreams about sheaves of wheat in the Torah, specifically, by the way. Think about that word, alumot.
Right. I went to go check you on this, and I went to Pharaoh's dream, which also includes crops.
We have different words for wheat. Interestingly, Pharaoh does talk about wheat, so one wonders whether there is some sort of interrelationship or correspondence between Pharaoh's dream about wheat and Joseph's dream about wheat. We can leave that for later. But that aside, the notion of alumot just happens to be a really direct reference to Joseph, because that is the very unusual word which is used to describe the stalks of wheat in the Joseph dream. And lest you think that is coincidental, I will ask you, Imu, exactly how many times do you think alumot appears in the entire Hebrew Bible?
I think you usually don't ask a question like that unless it's just these two times.
But as far as I know, it's just these two times. It's Psalm 126 and Genesis 37, and that's it. There is no other alumot in the entire Hebrew Bible, to such an extent that when alumot shows up in this very unusual word, shows up for the first and only time in the 5 books of Moses in Genesis 37, Rashi, whose job it is to tell us what strange words mean, struggles to figure out what the word means and says, oh, look at Psalm 126. That will tell us what the word means. And
Mm,
through context in Psalm 126, it's like, oh, yeah, these are like stalks of wheat. That's what alumot are. So it
hmm
seems like this very striking comparison. It really feels like Shir HaMaalot is channeling Joseph's dream if you put the two images from the beginning of the dream and the end of the dream together. Um, so that's what it seems like. But you might say, I don't know, maybe it's still a coincidence. Here's the thing, though. Go to the middle of the psalm, verse 4, the beginning of the second part of the psalm. Shuva Shem Tzvitenu Ka'afikim Banegev. That's a very um, particular metaphor there. God, return our captives, Ka'afikim Banegev, like flash floods in the desert, right?
hmm
Afikim is a highly unusual word, so unusual that it actually appears nowhere in the five books of Moses. But that's actually only partially true. The word afikim does not appear in the five books of
I know
Moses,
where you're going.
but it does appear somewhere in the five books of Moses if you tweak it a bit. Afikim is a noun, right? What if you verbified afikim? What if you took afikim and made it into a verb?
Lahit
It,
apek
there it is. And where does that appear? Oh, Imu.
lo yuchal lahit apek. Yosef is trying to. He's struggling to hold back his tears.
That's right. Lo
When he's
yachol Yosef lehitapek. Yosef could not hold his tears back, and he starts sobbing, right, when he reveals himself to his brothers. So Afikim does appear once in the Torah as well, really twice. Vayitapak the first time, Joseph holds himself back, and the second time he can't hold himself back, and his tears come like floodwaters. These are the only times you have anything like the word Afikim in the five books of Moses. So is it a coincidence that the beginning, the end, and the middle of Shir HaMaalot seem to take you back to the Joseph story? Is there something about why? And you think to yourself, but that's crazy. Why would Shir HaMaalot be talking about the Joseph story of all things? Well, is there anything about the Joseph story that we remind you about the general theme of Shir HaMaalot?
I mean, thematically, he's the first to exile, right?
That's right.
He's the first captive.
First captive, first guy ever taken out of Canaan, right? And he's the first guy to ever return. Now, he doesn't quite return in the sense of returning to the land, but even he comes back in the sense that there is a reunification between Joseph and his family. So, in a way, there's a certain kind of Shivat Zion. When is that moment of Shivat Zion? Like, if you would have to pinpoint it, right? That moment of reunification with family, isn't it interesting that that moment takes place at the Afikim Banegev moment? At Lo Yachol Yosef Lechit Apek, that actually is the climactic moment when Joseph breaks down in tears. And what's the next word he say? He says to Judah and to all the brothers who are sitting there astounded, Ani Yosef, I am Joseph. He reveals himself, and suddenly the brothers are back together.
Interesting. The revelation moment happens at a lo yachol litapek. The dam breaks,
The dam
and
breaks.
and that which was dry becomes flooded with water, and
And
it's the
what's the
moment of
water in this
redemption.
case? And
Tears.
what is the water? It says tears. And it's like literally Afikim Banegev, because like you're going hiking in the Negev, right? You're thinking there's no water here.
Dry, dry,
This is
dry.
dry, dry, dry. If you're Judah, right? And there's this stone-hearted Egyptian who just keeps on throwing obstacles in your way, accuses you of being spies and everything, and doesn't really care, and sent you back, and doesn't matter, and nothing matters to
Yeah.
him, making your life hard, and you're cursing, like, how come we got this guy? It's terrible. It's the worst. And you're thinking, like, man, he doesn't have a heart. He doesn't have a heart. He doesn't have a heart. Can you imagine your surprise, your shock when all of a sudden Mr. Hard-hearted Egyptian just breaks down in tears and sobs and can't stop crying? It's Afikim Banegev. It's flash
hmm
floods in the desert, those
hmm
tears, right? So could it be that Shir HaMaalot is describing literally the very first Shivat Zion, the first time any individual kidnapped person ever comes back to his people? is actually Joseph. The Joseph story, that moment of reunification, is the first reunification of Shivat Zion, of a prisoner of Zion coming back to his family. And if so, what is Shir HaMaalot trying to tell us about the Joseph story? Or what is the Joseph story, in a way, coming to tell us about Shir HaMaalot? And that's what I want to explore with you here.
So we had established what seemed like a pretty strong connection between the Shir HaMaalos and the Yosef story, both in terms of the wording of the texts and even a thematic link with the returning captives. But remember, the reason Rabbi Fohrman had shared the connections between these two narratives was because he thought that they would help us understand the second half of Shir HaMaalos. In fact, we'd already examined the first verse of that second half, Shuva Hashem et Shevitenu Ka'afikim Banegev. And those words even hinted to a theme that Rabbi Fohrman suspected was integral to those very verses, a theme that he was now ready to explore with me.
What I want to suggest is, if laughter and song is the idea, the modes of the first part of the psalm, as we talked about last episode, tears are the theme of the second half of the psalm. And it's not just Afikim Banegev, it's the next things too, right? Afikim Banegev might be a reference to Joseph's tears, but now listen to the next words of Psalm 126. Azorim Bedima, those who plant with tears, Barina Yiktaru, will ultimately reap in joy. Haloch Yelechu Vacho, there's a man walking around crying. No se Meshach Hazara, he's holding a bag of seeds. Bo Yavo Barina, that man, one day he's going to come in song. No say Alumosav, he's going to come holding triumphantly his sheaves. And now the question I have for you is, if Shir HaMaalot is channeling on some level the Joseph story, if Joseph is the one who cries Afikim Banegev, who's the one who's crying here? It's a very different kind of tears than Afikim Banegev. Afikim Banegev is all of a sudden, bam, there's just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing, overwhelming tears. But there's a different kind of tears, just somebody who's walking around every day, just cries a little bit more. What would this be a reference to if we're talking about the Joseph story? Who's the guy who cries, Haloch Yelechu Vacho? Every day he's walking around crying.
It's interesting because I would have thought that this is continuing to describe Yosef, but when you gave that preamble, I realized like Yosef doesn't look like he's crying every day. In fact,
No.
he's the picture of strength. His pains are buried deep. And you even hear that he's trying to hold back tears the first time and he's successful, and the second time he's not successful. So he's not the walking man who's crying. And if it's not Yosef, is there somebody who cries a lot and actually doesn't stop crying? That reminds me of his father, of Yaakov.
It does. So let's actually go to those verses, right? What it really is the case that Jacob, the second he hears about the loss of Yosef, intuits something, that he's always going to be walking around crying. Vayima'en lihitnachem. He refused to be consoled. People tried to console him. The whole point of consolation is to stop crying. Vayima'en litnachem. He would not be consoled. Ki ered el beni avel shola. I will go down to my grave mourning Joseph. When Jacob says that I am going to go down to my grave mourning Joseph, so the sages, including Rashi, wonder about that. How is it that you cannot be consoled? Everybody gets consoled. Death is always awful, but we can always move on. Jacob thinks that Joseph is dead, so why can't he move on? Why does he say, I'm going to go down to, and he really does go down to his grave mourning Joseph. He never gets over it. When he shows up at Pharaoh, he tells Pharaoh what a terrible life he's had. He really has been mourning every single day of his life. Why? And Rashi says, because Joseph wasn't really dead. The whole point of mourning is that when death is, it's final, it's over, and you can somehow heal. But if it's not over, you can never heal. And Jacob somehow intuits that, even though he thinks consciously that he's dead. And here goes the unconscious again, almost like a dream. The unconscious part of Jacob is like, I don't know about this. And somehow it's like, I can't get over this. Then the second half of the psalm, you have two images of people crying that are almost opposites of each other. On the one hand, you have Joseph crying. He's Mr. Afikim Banegev. He is Mr. Stone Cold guy, super dry, desert-like person, never feels like he's ever going to break, and all of a sudden, there he is, Lo Yachol Yosef Lihit Apek, when Joseph can't hold himself back and he sobs. On the other hand, earlier in the story, you have Jacob, and throughout the story, you have Jacob. He's the guy who's halach yelahu vacho, walking around crying. So let's try to put these two things together. And the question I would ask is, these two sets of tears, Joseph's tears, the sobs, and Jacob's tears, these everyday tears, are they connected to one another or not? Are they just two images of like, oh yeah, like there were two people crying? Isn't that interesting? But Shir HaMaalot is putting them back to back, is just like giving you these two images right after each other, even though in like the text of Genesis, they're not right after each other. Like Jacob's tears are Genesis 37.
Right.
Joseph's tears are all the way at the end of the story. But Shir HaMaalot comes and just sandwiches these back to back. And I want to suggest that Shir HaMaalot actually is laying out a connection between the tears. In Shir HaMaalot's view, I want to suggest Jacob's tears are deeply connected to Joseph's when Joseph reveals himself. Jacob's set of tears, in a deep kind of way, is responsible for Joseph's, which is the deep meaning of Azorim Bedima Barina Yiksoru. When Jacob was walking around crying, and you had interviewed him, Jacob, is there any meaning to your tears? Are your tears doing anything? Jacob would have looked at you like you were stark raving mad. That's not why you cry. You don't cry to achieve something. You cry because you just cry. You're broken, and you can't imagine there's anything good with these tears. They're just the expression of bitterness. And what I want to do is sketch out to you how it is that Jacob's tears set up Joseph's tears. I'll give you the first of those theories in this session, and then we'll come back next time, and I'll try to give you the second one.
So Yaakov is constantly crying over his son for years. And while Yosef doesn't cry for all that time, he then bursts forth with this flash flood of tears. And Rabbi Fohrman was suggesting that even though these two sets of tears seem to have nothing to do with each other in the text of Genesis, Shir HaMaalot is indicating that they're somehow linked, that in some way, Yaakov's continuous crying actually causes Yosef to weep all those years later. It was an interesting idea, but how could that be true? And what would it even mean? To dig into this, Rabbi Fohrman took us back to the moment when Yosef finally bursts forth with those tears, the same exact moment that he reveals himself to his brothers.
Ask yourself why it is that Joseph reveals himself when he does. He could have revealed himself at lots of different places. He could have lost it in all sorts of different places. The Torah even says that Joseph cried earlier, held himself back, but there's a moment where he just like literally cannot hold himself back. It sounds like he wanted to hold himself back. It sounded like he was, if it was up to Joseph, like, no, I'll keep on holding myself back, right? What is it that happened that caused Joseph to finally lose it? Well, part of the answer to that question might be with like, well, why was it that he was trying to hold himself back? Like a lot of people read the Joseph story and they assume that Joseph, he always was going to reveal himself. It was just a matter of when. He was very calculated and he figured out like exactly when he was going to reveal. But if you look carefully at the story, that's actually not what the text tells you. Text tells you, Lo Yachol Yosef Lihitapek. He could not hold himself back anymore. His emotions overcame him, which suggests that were it not for the fact that his emotions overcame him, he would not have revealed himself to his brothers. He might never have revealed himself to his brothers. So I want to introduce you to something, really reintroduce you to a theory I sketched out in my book, The Exodus Yona's Passed Over, which really isn't my theory. It's the theory of Rav Yoel ben Nun. Rav Yoel ben Nun wrote this up in the first issue of the Tanakh Journal Megadim. And he has this really provocative theory that Joseph might well have been the victim of a terrible misunderstanding. You have to understand that when you're reading the Joseph story, you're getting information that no character has. The narrator is giving you information, but not every character in the story has the same information that you have. In particular, Joseph doesn't have the information that you have. Joseph is on his way down to Egypt. He's in an Ishmaelite caravan heading down to Egypt to be sold as a slave. And as that's happening, the text tells you back in Canaan what the brothers are doing. The brothers are taking Joseph's coat and dipping it in blood and bringing it back to his father. But Joseph has no way of knowing that that's what happened. Now, if Joseph has no way of knowing that the brothers dipped the coat in blood and brought it back to their father, what terrible misconception might Joseph be under that we, the reader, know isn't true?
That dad was in on it.
Maybe dad was in on it. Either maybe dad was in on it from the beginning, or maybe the others came back and convinced dad. Let's just look at it from Joseph's perspective. There I was 17 years old, and like things were going okay. And suddenly, I started having these dreams, and dad was favoring me. There was all these tensions in the family, but dad knew about those tensions. And then one day, dad dispatched me to go check on my brothers in Shechem. Go all alone to my brothers in Shechem, Shechem of all places, where massacres happened, brought to you by Shimon and Levi of all people. And, I was nervous about that. This doesn't seem so wonderful to me. But look, Dad, if you want me to go check on my brothers, sure, I'll go check on my brothers. Hineni, I said, I'm ready to do whatever it is that you want. And I trusted you. I trusted you that things would go okay, but things did not go okay. I was jumped. I was put in a pit. And next thing I know, I'm bumping along down to Egypt in this caravan, being sold as a slave. And my whole life has been turned upside down. And now my question is, how come there was never any search party? How come I go down to Egypt and that's it for Joseph? Never hear from him again. And isn't it interesting that Joseph in Egypt, when he finally gets elevated to a position of power and he can do whatever he wants. He's there in Egypt for years, and he never writes a postcard to his father, who he clearly loved so much. Why doesn't he send some word to his father, who he loves, that he's okay? And Rav Yoel ben Nun's answer is that the terrible misconception Joseph might have been under is that maybe I was kicked out of the family. And it's not like it never happened before.
Mm-hmm.
2 generations before this, Ishmael was kicked out of the family. A generation before, Esau was kicked out of the family. Is this the third time? Is it that Leah finally had too much of this child of Rachel that was favored? And one way or the other, either it was all a plot and Jacob was in on it, or it wasn't. And the brothers came back to dad and said, hey, it was either him or us. And somehow the family is moving on without me, and I am left for dead. And therefore, maybe Yoel ben Nun suggests Joseph never plans on revealing himself to his brothers. He feels that he was kicked out of the family. And therefore, maybe when he sees Benjamin, the whole plan with the cup and the silver and the plot and all of that is really just a ruse. It's just a way to get Benjamin with him in Egypt. He cannot abide the notion of, if this is what the brothers did to me, who knows what they're doing to Benjamin? I'm going to take this other child of Rachel. I'm going to save him from their clutches. And he's all too happy to send everybody back. Goodbye, guys. I'm going to take Benjamin, and we'll be here, and we'll set up the Confederate States of Rachel on the other side of the Nile. We'll do our own thing. Good riddance to everybody else. And that is Joseph's plan. But if that is Joseph's way of seeing things, at some point, something shatters the illusion. Judah shatters the illusion. What is it that Judah tells Joseph in his impassioned speech that completely destroys Joseph's illusion, Joseph's narrative, his story of what might have happened?
And he reveals his father's reaction to the first loss, to the loss of Yosef.
And essentially what he says is, Father has been crying for you all along. He's been mourning you. He was so broken up. He said, Ki ered el b'ni avashol, I'm going to go down to my grave mourning his child, and therefore he couldn't let Benjamin go because he couldn't abide the loss of 2 children. Shnayim yalda li'ishti, my beloved wife, gave birth to 2 children. It broke me up so much. When one was taken, I'll die if the second is taken. And suddenly, it hits Joseph like cold water. It's like, oh my gosh, he was crying for me all along. Therefore, in a very real way, one might argue that Hazorim Bedima Barina Yikzoru means that it doesn't just mean that those who plant with tears, those who plant seeds while they're crying, Barina Yikzoru, will eventually, get their wheat. It means in a way that sometimes when you're crying, the tears themselves are the seeds. Hazorim Bedima, those who sow with tears, you could read it that the tears are the seeds. What if you came to Jacob and said, Jacob, those tears that you're crying, that you say you'll always be crying for him, do you know what they're going to do? Those tears are seeds. They're going to bring back Joseph. He would have looked at you like you're mad, like you're crazy. There's no way. I'm just crying. How can my tears bring back Joseph? But there's a lot that Jacob doesn't know. Jacob doesn't know that Joseph really isn't dead. And the one thing that's holding him back is the suspicion that I was thrown out of the family. If you asked Jacob when he was sending his brothers off to Egypt to go search for foods, and you had said, what are they searching for in Egypt? He would have said, food. We need food. The most basic thing we need is food. We're searching for wheat. But in reality, right, what are the brothers really searching for? What do they end up finding? In a way, they find something even more precious than food. They find the lost child, right? And Joseph in the dream, what was he? He was an aluma. He was a sheaf of wheat. Along comes Shir HaMaalot and says, well, in the end, guess what he's going to have? He's going to have his sheaves of wheat. But there's two meanings to the sheaves of wheat. He's going to get his food. But he's not just going to get his food. He's going to get the child that in the dream was the sheaf of wheat, right? And how is he going to get it? He's going to get it because he planted with tears, because his tears were themselves seeds. The fact that every single day Jacob was crying just a little bit more, when he realizes that, leads to that flood of tears, those sobs. And Jacob's tears catalyze Joseph's tears and bring Joseph back to the family. So what we have here then is one way of interpreting the second half of Shir HaMaalot. Hazorim Bedima Barina Yigzoru means that sometimes tears can themselves be a kind of seed. Tears, they have a meaning that's often hidden from us, that in some ways that we can't understand, they catalyze a kind of connection with those that we love, that our tears somehow are part of the story of how we can reconnect with those people. The tears are meaningful in ways that we can't even imagine. Now, if you see it that way, then one could argue that Shir HaMaalot is using this as a paradigm for some sort of future redemption, which is that we too, when we cry about captives of Zion, it could also be that our tears are seeds, that the same way that Jacob's tears indicated a connection to those who were lost that would not die, and that tearful indication of connection was enough to unmask a high Egyptian official. So in Shir HaMaalot's case, who would be the one who would be, quote, the high Egyptian official, the one who's in charge of keeping the captives of Zion captive and behind and away from the rest of their family? In this case, that would be God, right? And yet in response to tears, indicating this incredible connection, God, like Joseph, can almost himself become, so to speak, overcome and unmask himself and allow for a reunification of captives with their family. And that might be something of the message of what Shir HaMaalot is trying to get across. Don't discount the power of your tears.
On the surface, tears seem like the least productive things of all. Like they're no more than a reaction to loss or an instinctive expression of sadness and bitterness. But this read of the Yosef story was suggesting that tears may be so much more than that. Tears can have power. In the case of Yaakov, his tears were so powerful that they even brought his captive son back to him. They changed the outcome of the story. And maybe, at times, our tears can do the same. Maybe when we cry, our tears aren't just falling to the ground. Maybe they too are seeds that can germinate and sprout and sometimes even yield redemption and reunion. And perhaps when the ultimate redemption comes, we may even look back and find that our tears were part of what helped bring us there. I found this idea really moving and comforting. But while all that may be true, there was something that didn't sit quite right with me. Sure, Yaakov's tears may have brought Yosef back to him in that story in Genesis. And maybe sometimes our tears can do the same. But aren't there so many times where we cry and it doesn't bring back the ones we've lost? Not every story is the Yaakov story. Not every tear changes the outcome. What about those tears? Do all those tears that I've personally cried, that we've all cried, have no meaning? Well, remember that Rabbi Fohrman said that he had a second read of the tears in Shir HaMaalot? And that new read will address this very question, suggesting that tears may have a mysterious, meaningful impact regardless of the outcome. What is this potential deeper meaning to tears, and how might it alter our understanding of Shir HaMaalot? You're going to have to tune in next time to find out. Hi again. While most people are watching cat videos online, you're exploring Torah content. That makes you pretty cool. But if you want a lot more meaningful Jewish learning, you should try out Aleph Beta. We have 1,000 animated videos and deep dive podcasts just like this one. In other words, plenty of Divrei Torah that you can use to impress your in-laws at the Shabbos table or Seder. But even more than that, it's actually a lot of opportunities to connect directly and intimately to the Torah text itself, without any algorithms feeding you cat videos. There's a link to Aleph Beta in the description, and I hope you check it out.